Putin didn't start out as a deranged tyrant. Here is a remarkable clip of Putin in 2002, watching an old interview where he tells Russians that totalitarianism is a big threat.
На мой взгляд, в нашей стране поворот к тоталитаризму на какой-то период времени возможен. Нам всем кажется, что если навести твердый порядок жесткой рукой, то всем нам станет жить лучше, комфортнее и безопаснее. На самом деле, эта комфортность очень быстро пройдет, потому что эта жесткая рука начнет нас очень быстро душить.
So that's Putin years before the Kremlin. So what does he say once he is president?
Нечего добавить почти что, как будто вчера это было. Не 11 лет назад, а вчера.
That's the world's most ill-famed tyrant 20 and 30 years ago giving a warning about the very thing that he went on to do. Did he mean it? No. But it wasn't as absurd a lie as it would be today. At that point, Putin had not yet developed the dictator diseases that we're going to learn about in this video. This is not a factual history video. It's a breakdown of Putin's psychological breakdown, broken down into 4 distinct phases of his rule. Let me orient you in under 60 seconds. These are Putin's terms, and these are the policy flavors. Term 1. Putin inauthentically holds in his expansionist, reactionary, populist tendencies. Term 2. These tendencies fully come out. Then Putin cedes the stage to Medvedev and hates it. Term 3 is obscurantist and imperialist. Term 4 is 3, but worse. Eventually, Putin transcends terms, starts a mystical and isolationist policy of war against the West, and introduces elements of totalitarianism at home. That's the breakdown of his terms in power. But how does this relate to the psychological phases of Putin's power and degeneration? I'm going to tell you about the 4 phases that brought him from 1999 to the Putin we've got today. Phase 1. Here, Putin's mental world is that of a measured, corrupt autocrat, and that roughly coincides with the first 2 terms. Phase 2. Putin develops a sense of mission for Russia with him at the center of it, and that happens around 2012. Phase 3. Putin gets progressively paranoid about everything, and this happens around the middle of the 2010s. Phase 4. Putin loses a sense of reality during COVID isolation. The first phase, Putin's first 8 years in power, is a move from inauthenticity to authenticity. At first, Putin paid lip service to democracy and reluctantly renewed some of Yeltsin's policies, but eventually he settled into what he was comfortable with in his skin. That's populism, autocracy, kleptocracy, and expansionism abroad. Western media and Western leaders sometimes projected democratic values onto Putin, and he paid lip service to these values. In 2000, he said that a free press is the most important guarantor of the irreversibility of our country's democratic course. As late as 2004, he said Ukraine is welcome to join the European Union. I never liked Putin from the beginning, and as the Chechen war raged, as media freedoms wobbled, as Putin brought back the Soviet anthem, other people too thought, oh no. The Soviet dissident Valeria Novodvorskaya said, do not trust the Chekists. And there was somebody else who didn't like where Putin was going, and that was Boris Yeltsin. This is an extraordinary scene that speaks 1,000 words. That's Yeltsin, in retirement, reacting to Putin bringing back the Soviet national anthem. You'll see that Yeltsin says a lot with silence, but he does say one word, and that's Krasnenka. And that's a diminutive word for red, so reddish, i.e. the reddish tint of the communist past is symbolically being brought back, and for Yeltsin that's not a compliment. But it also means pretty, which is of course implied sarcastically. So Yeltsin is saying this is ugly and garish and unlovely. This is quite extraordinary home video sort of footage of breathtaking power.
А гимн возвращали без вас. И даже новый текст его совсем не спасает.
Vitaly Mansky, the filmmaker, said of that word that it absorbed into itself all the grief and bitterness felt in the face of Putin's reanimation of the Soviet past. Putin never got it. Putin never got democracy. But here is a question. Did Putin go expansionist and autocratic because it was inevitably necessary to protect him, protect his kleptocratic pals, protect their money? Or did he go expansionist and autocratic because he believed in that? It was certainly both. He believed in autocracy and didn't have a democratic bone in his body. So he was an autocrat at heart from the beginning. And I mean the beginning. For instance, here is something extraordinary. Putin never believed in the concept of political opposition. And I don't mean that he didn't want to have political opponents who weren't dead or poisoned or in jail. I mean that he didn't believe that there could be political opponents. The idea of political opposition, of course, implies sharing in a mutually cooperative enterprise, and then over and above that, engaging in rivalry and competition according to mutually agreed rules. So you try to beat your opponents at tennis, but you don't bang them over the head with a racket. And for Putin, yes, there are cases when players indeed play and don't resort to banging each other on the head with a racket, but for him that's only because in that particular instance they judged that they couldn't get away with beating the other player up. But if they could, they always would. So for Putin, there is no tennis. Just like for Putin, there is no democracy. Democracy is just a kind of good news story that's fake, that Western societies tell themselves about themselves. Let me demonstrate this for you in a remarkable way. Here is an iconic Russian journalist describing a one-on-one, 2-hour-long candid conversation with Putin in the year 2000. And here is what Putin told him.
Понимаешь? Есть враги, а есть предатели. С врагами воюешь, потом заключаешь перемирие, потом мир, потом они становятся союзниками в другой войне. Но ты помнишь, что они враги. Вот ты с ними потом опять воюешь, возможно это, но всегда лицо в лицо. А предатель – это тот человек, который с тобой рядом, но в момент, когда ты ослаб, или ему кажется, что ты ослаб, дословно помню, он тебе, значит, в спину или под коленку, и вот к ним, говорит он, никакой пощады. Я, естественно, говорю, а в вашей конструкции после всего этого... Я у вас-то кто? Говорит, не, Леш, ну ты враг. Говорю, слава тебе, Господи, Боже мой.
Putin tried Medvedev and hated it. He gave Medvedev power, but was watching Medvedev's every step. His verdict was damning. He concluded that Medvedev's rule was unstable and ineffective. One of the last straws for Putin was how he perceived Medvedev indulging the West over Libya. For Putin, this was an existential threat to Russia, because his nightmare is what happened to Gaddafi. His nightmare is what happened to Saddam. So Putin came back, and this was the first major escalation in Putin's psychological deterioration. Because in his mind, coming back was good, not just for Putin, but also for Russia. Now, Putin had this sense of mission, and he felt that Russia's civilizational destiny was now allied with the will of a single individual, Putin. This is the phenomena of leaders ceasing to see any difference between their deepest moral intuitions and their sense of self-advancement. Doing what serves you and saving the world become the same thing. This is not unique to dictators. Even democratic leaders sometimes succumb to that. This happened in my country, Britain, with Tony Blair and the Iraq War. Blair, who is a political genius, whether you like him or despise him, has always had this sort of providential sense of his political visions.
To show that we will stand up for what we know to be right. To show that we will confront the tyrannies and dictatorships and terrorists who put our way of life at risk. To show at the moment of decision that we have the courage to do the right thing.
With Iraq, his moral intuitions, his sense of self-advancement, and his reflective processes all became won. And this caused him to lose a sense of reality in 2003. And later, it caused him to be unable to feel a proportionate degree of shame about what he had done. With politicians like that, we can ask, are they saying what they're saying because they believe it? Or are they saying it because it serves them? And the right answer that we should give is they believe it because it serves them. That's a cartoonish answer too, but it's not entirely wrong. So what's that got to do with Putin? Well, it highlights the difference between a deluded democratic leader and a deluded autocrat. Blair got himself deluded about Iraq and foreign policy. Putin got himself deluded about all of politics. It's at about this time that Putin began to fancy himself as a direct follower of 19th century Russian Tsars, above all Alexander III. So he was now thinking of himself as a Tsar in the grand panorama of the history of the Russian Empire. But it was about to get worse, because Putin's sense of mission was about to get complemented by an even more debilitating degeneration, and that's descent into ever greater paranoia. You remember we played the clip of the journalist who went to see Putin in the year 2000 to talk about traitors and enemies. Well, now we're in 2015 and Putin's definitions of enemy and traitor get further upgraded. They become even more paranoid. The first new paranoid supplement that Putin introduces to his view is that he now thinks that any opposition to the regime in Russia has to be about either money or power. It can't really be about values or ideas or collective aspirations. No, it's got to be cynical and selfish. And the second, even more extraordinarily paranoid supplement he now adds is that basically all enemies of the regime in Russia are not really inherently local. They are all overseas sponsored. So this is just malign foreign interference. It's various Western agencies. It's the State Department. So you see, he's reached this extraordinary level of paranoia where he isn't just saying that there isn't such a thing as opposition. He's now saying there even aren't enemies of his in Russia, because there couldn't be enemies of his in Russia. Now, all enemies are just sort of masquerading malign foreign forces. And if you got rid of these foreign forces, you would get rid of any prospect of revolution. The very idea of revolution for Putin now is simply a foreign-sponsored incursion. As long as you keep such incursions out, your rule is safe. Now I want to show you something important, but first I want to explain why it's so pertinent. This is Gleb Pavlovsky. Pavlovsky is not just a random political commentator. He used to be Putin's advisor. He used to be for a decade and a half a consultant to the Kremlin, and he was central in Putin's 2000 campaign. He helped get Putin elected, and he helped construct the political personality of the early Putin. I'm going to show you a clip from an interview Pavlovsky did in 2020, where he declared that Putin's political personality was now in ruins, and that Putin is beset and can't stop raving on about fictional threats and fictional dangers that keep assailing him. And that's all coming at the expense of Putin's ability to actually look at reality. Here is Pavlovsky.
Его действия, как правило, деструктивны. Он постоянно, по-моему, в состоянии какого-то страха. Но эти страхи фантомные. Это страхи невротические. Если речь шла вот о вашем соседе, подумали бы, с парнем что-то не так. Но это президент и главнокомандующий ядерной державы.
So why has this happened to Putin? The key answer is 15 years at the top with increasingly unchecked power. That time is what did it. Limitless power in politics is not freedom. It's paranoia. If there are no checks and balances that limit you, then you wake up every day uncertain about the extent of your power. So you need to check it. You need to keep checking to make sure that it's as limitless today as it was yesterday. Being above the law means that you never know the shape, the contours of the political geography around you. And you need to keep preempting your limitless power from becoming limited by taking preemptive steps every day. And the war is in part a response to Putin feeling that some of his power is slipping away to other people in the elites around him, in the court around him. For now, he has that power back, but at a cost. Putin has made himself more central by starting this war, but also more vulnerable. And again, it's worse than this. In 2020, Putin went into preemptive COVID isolation, and to even vaguely find yourself in the same space as him, you needed to isolate for 2 weeks. Before, Putin couldn't be disciplined by checks and balances. Now he couldn't be disciplined even by criticism or by conversation with people around him who might have a slightly different perspective on the key issues. I've been covering the wider cultural and political ramifications of the war since the beginning. I've followed Russian politics closely for over 20 years, and it's my guess that not a single person in Putin's Security Council would have started a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, except Putin. We could see Narishkin, the foreign intelligence chief, being shaken and surprised by the prospect of a full-scale war. And these people are delusional and corrupt, but even among them, Putin's alone. As the beautiful writer and ex-psychiatrist Anthony Storr wrote a couple of decades back, grandiosity and isolation march hand in hand. Basically, Putin ceased to be teachable by anybody about anything of significance. Putin was always a killer, and he was a prolific killer, comparatively. If you think like I do, that to be the leader of any major power, you have to be a killer to some degree. Barack Obama explained this eloquently with his alleged remark that in him, the United States had a president who was good at killing. By good at killing, Obama didn't mean that he was good at killing indiscriminately or without remorse. No, he meant that he was good at killing a limited amount without completely losing his moral compass and without losing the ability to sleep or to function. And Obama in particular was referring to his Tuesday meetings to compile drone kill lists. Putin, on the other hand, kills without a moral compass. He always did, even in the early days, but now he has got worse. And that's because Putin's sense of mission, his paranoia, his loss of contact with reality, his lowered sense of danger, make his present and future killings worse and potentially a threat to the world. And that includes nuclear risk. All of this is, in a way, a lesson for us, a lesson about what happens when you don't have changes of government, a lesson about what happens when you say, let's give the job to this guy and screw the institutions, screw the checks and balances, let's just give it to him and he can do the job. It did not have to end this way, but the only alternative was Putin leaving early. I wouldn't have liked Putin's record if he left in 2008, but to many Russians he would have been a hero, because here is a guy who left power voluntarily. Here is a guy who was a strong president. Here is a guy who presided, even if it's by coincidence, over an economically successful period. There isn't a scenario in which Putin could have stayed and not lost the plot. The only person in Putin's role who could have not lost the plot is the kind of person who would never for a moment entertain taking a job like that, particularly in a sort of amorphous autocratic regime. This is not a story about one very bad man who went on to do very bad things. This is the story of what happens when you give up on all free and independent institutions. This need is universal in our world. Being able to change your government through election, having courts that work, having some capacity to criticize the government without going to jail is a precondition of any sustainable politics in the modern world. Without it, you have the kind of mess that Russia is now going to spend 100 years coming out of. 100 years after Putin is dead, Russia will accept Ukraine's independence, just like Russia accepted Poland's independence after hyperventilating about supposed Polish betrayal in the 19th century. It could happen sooner, and that in part depends on how Russians reckon with taking responsibility for their culture and their politics going off the rails. And to learn more about that, watch this video next.